Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. Today we're looking at part 3 of the Science Uprising series, and as this is part of a series, feel free to start with part 1. This time the title is DNA is a Code, Who Coded It? So I can tell from the title that they are likely going to go in the direction of taking the DNA to computer code analogy way further than it was ever meant to go. So let's take a look.
We've shown that DNA is actually the software of life. It's totally interchangeable between the digital world and the biological world.
That is Dr. Craig Venter, who is a geneticist. He started a company that was competing with the Human Genome Project for the honor of being the first people to sequence the human genome. Ultimately, he did end up sharing credit with the Human Genome Project for the sequencing. In this instance, he is referring to his use of computers in creating synthetic bacteria and how they can use the ones and zeros that a computer uses to set up which nucleotide bases go into a sequence. What he is not saying is that the genes themselves are perfectly analogous to computer code.
The DNA code itself is so digital, is so almost exactly like a computer tape.
Totally interchangeable.
I've often wondered exactly what Dawkins means when he says that DNA is digital. I think he means as opposed to analog. In analog signals, there is an alternating current frequency that is modified to carry the signal by either amplifying it or changing the frequency in order to carry information. In digital signals, all the information is converted into a series of ones and zeros during transmission. So in that sense, if we are making an analogy comparing DNA to information, it is less analogous to analog than to digital. But that is purely because of the fact that you can write its sequence out as a series of letters rather than writing it out as a waveform, and when transcribed, the same sequence of letters will always result in the same amino acid to a point where there's a handy little chart that you can refer to that tells you which three-letter sequence will result in which amino acids. But remember, these letters are not letters like we think of them. They are stand-ins for actual chemicals. A chemical itself is not, to the best of my knowledge, analogous to a digital signal.
Interchangeable.
The DNA code itself
It's the software of life.
is so digital.
Scientists have come to the amazing conclusion that our bodies contain digital code. In fact, Bill Gates, the founder of Microsoft, tweeted, "DNA is more advanced than any software ever created."
Bill Gates. Yeah, I'm sure he's an expert on genetics. But now why would he be saying that it's more advanced? The second sentence of that tweet that you left unhighlighted might provide a clue. He seems to be tweeting about the ability to use DNA as a data storage mechanism. So let me just look up this tweet to see if I can get any more context from it. And oh, would you look at that? You guys left out the part of this tweet where he linked to an article about using DNA as data storage. In this case, Microsoft having stored the Rube Goldberg version of the OK Go music video, This Too Shall Pass. Could it possibly be that Gates calling DNA more advanced than software is just a reference to its ability to store data in a compact manner? And that it's simply a function of the fact that there are 4 base pairs, so every bit of data can contain twice the information as a traditional magnetic or optical storage device? It's also more stable. Hard drives and optical drives typically have a shelf life of 30-ish years, while a DNA molecule could potentially last for a few thousand years without degrading. Data read times are rather slow at the moment, though. The DNA has to be sequenced, then converted into ones and zeros, and then read. At the moment, it looks like the most practical use for DNA storage would be for archiving, where the read and write times are not all that important. So yeah, Bill Gates once tweeted using language that could be taken as an implication that DNA was designed. That's not the intention behind his tweet, but I see how it could be taken that way.
Think about it. A program or code is written by someone very smart.
I don't know about that. I went to college for computer programming. There were definitely some not smart people in my program, that's for sure.
The more complex the code, the more intelligent the author has to be.
Nope, not at all. Not even close. As I pointed out in last week's video, complexity is the hallmark of sloppy design. When designing your code, you want it to be as simple as possible. The more complex it is, the more opportunity there is for bugs to enter the code. Now, to carry out complex tasks, the code will have to reach a certain degree of complexity, but a good programmer will try to keep the code as simple as is feasible for the project, not only to keep out bugs, but also to make it easier for themselves and others to work on their code in the future. Just as an example of this, one of the programs I use to make my workflow more efficient is AutoHotkey. It's a neat little program that lets you essentially do anything that you want with your computer automatically. If I wanted to write a program in AutoHotkey that displays a message box with the message "Hello World," there are a few ways I could go about doing it. The simplest method would be just to direct a message box to say "Hello World." Alternatively, I could store each letter individually in a variable and then have the message box display the contents of the variables. This is certainly the more complex method of the two, but it uses more system resources to accomplish its task, and a future programmer looking at the code will have a harder time figuring out what it's supposed to do. Extrapolate this up to an actual important program like the computer's operating system, and it seems that if we work to make the code as simple as possible, it will run more efficiently and will allow other developers to more easily figure out which parts of the code are responsible for which actions.
So here's the question. If our DNA code is more complex than any man-made software, where did it come from?
Well, if it came from someone designing it, then they did a lousy job at designing it. Now, the DNA itself is more complex just by virtue of the fact that it is a molecule rather than ones and zeros, which is the point Bill Gates was getting at. But if you're looking at what is coded inside it, it's a big sloppy mess. To go back to my Hello World example, it would be like using the variable storage method of displaying the message box, but having a bunch of broken or commented out code scattered all over the place. All three codes accomplish an identical task, but the one that is the single line of code is the one that's a better design.
Is it possible it was authored without an author, programmed without a program? Materialists think so.
Loaded language aside, yes, it was authored without an author, if you want to call it that. And we can tell by looking at it, there are so many instances of broken code, unnecessary redundancies, broken redundancies, and so on, that we can say conclusively that if it were intelligently designed, the designer was lazy at best, didn't really know what he was doing in the middle option, or was malevolent at worst. If you wish to give any of these attributes to your god, then go ahead, claim that our genetic code was designed, because it looks like a jumbled mess of mutations that accumulated over time otherwise.
Through neo-Darwinism, the modern version of Darwinian evolution.
Neo-Darwinism is a vague term that, in my opinion, shouldn't really be used. Originally, it essentially meant natural selection without Lamarckian inheritance of acquired traits, with this usage going back to 1895, but then it was used to describe the combination of Darwinian natural selection with Mendelian genetics. Currently, it can mean different things depending on the context, but for now, I'll go with your overly simplistic, the modern version of Darwinian evolution, with the caveat that I would change the word version to understanding, as evolution itself does not change how it works, but our understanding of it is constantly becoming more and more accurate.
Stephen Meyer, author of the New York Times bestseller Darwin's Doubt, explains.
According to neo-Darwinism, new genetic information arises as a result of random mutations in the arrangement of the nucleotide bases along the spine of the DNA molecule.
Yep, that's essentially it. There are three main types of changes: insertions, where one or more base pairs are added into the molecule, deletions, where one or more are removed, and substitutions, where the base pair is swapped out for another one at the same spot.
If those random changes are beneficial, they're passed on and preserved, and if many such changes are preserved and passed on, they would accumulate over time and eventually result in a very significant change in the morphology, the form of the organism.
Yeah, that's a decent explanation.
That's like saying if this game had glitches every time it was copied online, and gamers shared their favorite mutated versions and trashed the rest, it would eventually turn into this. Come on, really?
Well, no. Remember, DNA is analogous to code. It is not identical. There is more to a game than just the lines of code. There are assets that the code will be pointing to. Modifying the code of the game itself will not create, say, a new audio file with a voice actor's recording for a specific character.
I'm scared, this hurts. I'm scared, this hurts. I'm scared, this hurts.
Okay, Ray, we're going to give you a little background on your character. You are bleeding from a gunshot wound to the rectum.
The rectum?
Yes, rectum.
Or a new texture map, because that's not what the code of the game is designed to do. It will tell the game how to use these textures in other files, but the files already have to be there. And that's not even getting to the hardware differences. The system requirements to run Pong are much lower than whatever the second game is. An argument could be made that you could write the code that actually draws out the texture and creates audio files, so it could be done through the code, though that would definitely be an example of inefficient and bad design. But there is no way for a line of code to affect how much physical memory the computer has. DNA, on the other hand, is actually capable of altering the physical and chemical structure of whatever body it is building. For instance, the way it is thought that snakes develop so many vertebrae was through a mutation in the OCT4 gene. One single mutation in this gene could direct the embryo to simply add more vertebrae. So that's one tiny little mutation that can result in a drastically longer body, and now there's a different body that can be mutated in different ways. Also, just as a fun fact, I briefly tried to figure out what game the second one was, so I googled the Alpha 9 Ides of March thing that was in the top of their screen, and it turns out, yes, the game is a release of a game called 0AD that is Alpha 9 the Ides of March. But most of the results on the page were for a bidet called the Alpha 9, so game developers, maybe Google what you're considering naming your game before you finalize that, unless you want to share a name with a bidet.
If we know the computer glitches won't produce a new video game, how much sense does it make to believe that glitches, copying errors, and our DNA code can produce new organisms?
As I said, the code of a video game does not create new assets or computer hardware, but the genetic code directly controls the hardware that is the body that it lives in. So yes, a change to the genetic code can create new organisms. Just look at agriculture. None of the crops we grow today look anything like their wild ancestors, and to the best of my knowledge, creationists accept that we have bred our crops from their wild counterparts. Broccoli is a type of mustard. Cauliflower, kale, kohlrabi, cabbage, and Brussels sprouts are all descended from the same wild mustard that gave us broccoli. That was all done through mutations and selective breeding within the last 3,000 years. 800 years in some cases. With those vastly different plants all sharing one common ancestor within just the last couple thousand years, imagine what could be accomplished over the span of 4 billion years. 3,000 years doesn't even show up on a bar graph if you put it beside 4 billion.
Could random mutations in DNA really produce this? 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 What about this? 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 Or this?
Yes, 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 and yes.
Everything we know about software shows that random changes in a section of functional code or functional information is going to degrade that information long before you ever get to something fundamentally new.
Small changes to code can make changes that don't break the program, especially if we start simple. So here's a Python script, just 7 lines of code. It simply draws 10 circles in a row overlapping. Now, through a duplication mutation, the entire code is copied out again, which results in 20 overlapping circles. And if there's a point mutation that changes this FD to an RT, we get 20 circles in a line that curve downward after the first 10. If we then get another point mutation that changes this number from a 10 to a 20, now we have 20 circles in a line that curve downward after the first 10, with the first 10 circles being twice the size of the last 10. But I cheated, I hear the creationists say. I started with a whole genome duplication. That's not fair. Well, it is fair because whole genome duplications really are a thing, but let's do this all again in a different order to see what happens. We'll start by changing this 1 to a 2, and then we get 10 half-size circles. Now we change this FD to an RT, and we get the half-size circles curving downward. Time for a whole genome duplication event, and now we have twice as many half-size circle curving around almost as if inside a bigger circle. Now let's take one step further and change this 0 to a 4, and we get this spirograph-looking circle filled with smaller circles. So that's some simple mutations of the kind that happen all the time in nature that result in changes that do not glitch everything out. It changes how the program works without breaking the program. Sure, there are more ways to change the code that would end up with it breaking the program, but in our little analogy, the code is copied almost perfectly every time, and the ones that change for the better are copied more times than the ones that stay the same or are changed for the worse. And of course, better or worse in living things is mostly a function of their environment, so something that might seem like it's a change for the worse could actually be beneficial. So depending on our code's environment, the pretty spirograph circle of circles might be detrimental when compared to the line of large circles with the curved small circles, or vice versa. And should these codes become genetically isolated somehow, remember the actual lines of code are the genes in this little analogy, it could be that the first variant is favored in whatever environment it finds itself in, and the second variant is favored in a different environment. Continue the changes after the split, and you will get two very different looking programs. Add sexual reproduction into the mix and it gets even more varied and complicated. And just to make my analogy even more accurate, some of you might have noticed that when I mutated the code to make the circle smaller, it didn't just shrink the size of the circle, the arrow that was drawing the circles went around the same line twice. That was not necessary. That happened because of the single point mutation that I executed. The number I changed was the angle at which the arrow turned. The circles are actually not perfect circles in this case, it's a series of very short straight lines that originally made 10-degree turns every 15 pixels on a loop that repeated these turns 36 times to make one circle. When I changed the number from 10 to 20, that made the arrow turn at 20 degrees instead of 10 degrees. The most optimal way to make the circle smaller would have been to loop it 18 times instead of 36 at that point, but I wanted to illustrate a single point mutation, so the loop repeating 36 times was vestigial code, leftovers from the original program that no longer function properly. You know, as often as I say that computer code is not a perfect analogy to DNA, it actually is pretty useful in helping us understand how mutations in evolution works. But it does remain flawed, because in computer code there is a direct one-to-one relationship between the code that is written and what the processor executes, while in DNA it is dependent entirely on the chemical makeup of the cell that the DNA is in. Remember, every cell in your body has your entire genome. So how does your eye know that it shouldn't be making toenails, and how do your toes know that they shouldn't build an eyeball? It depends on what proteins and chemicals can be found in the cells. Regulator proteins help in this regard, but that's a complicated topic that could be an entire video on its own, so let's get back to the monkey mask guy.
And that's the problem with the mutation selection mechanism as an explanation for new genetic information. Information in DNA is also essentially typographic or digital.
Can be represented typographically or digitally does not mean it is inherently typographic or digital. DNA has been around a lot longer than the letters C, A, G, and T.
And there are far more ways to go wrong in arranging those characters than there are ways to go right.
Yep, there sure are. This is where natural selection comes in, which weeds out the majority of detrimental mutations in favor of the few that are good. Oh, and let's not forget the fact that neutral mutations that do nothing are far more common than detrimental or beneficial ones. So those just build up and continue doing nothing other than provide us with a molecular clock for dating common ancestors.
And so as you begin to randomly change them, you inevitably fall into a non-functional abyss long before you ever generate anything fundamentally new.
Which is why it is important to note that there are actually a few mechanisms used by DNA to essentially proofread its replication and repair mutations. So most times DNA is copied accurately, which means that the mutations that will be extremely detrimental to the organism are relatively rare. Which also means that the beneficial mutations will be even more rare, but they do still happen, so evolution marches slowly onward.
So just how unlikely is it for random genetic changes to produce something new, even something as modest as a protein structure with a new function?
You mean like the ApoA1 Milano mutation that I've had to explain so frequently recently that I essentially know all the details by now, so I just have to hunt for the sources that talk about the aspects of this mutation that I want to talk about just so I can leave links? So in this instance, we have a variant of the apolipoprotein A1 that is the result of a mutation in one guy in the late 1700s, Giovanni Pomerelli. It modified the apolipoprotein found in human HDL in a way that basically prevents heart disease. That's a mutation that produced something new, even something as modest as a protein structure with a new function.
One scientist performed experiments that enabled him to actually calculate the odds, and they aren't good. In fact, they're next to impossible.
Not sure where you're going with this yet, but if the odds are larger than 0, then that means it is possible, no matter how tiny. Extremely small probability events happen all the time. When a raindrop falls, what are the odds of one specific raindrop hitting any one specific spot on the ground? Minuscule, next to impossible, but it happens. When a deck of cards is shuffled, what are the odds of it ending up in any given order? 1 in 10 to the 68. That's below the threshold that creationist mathematician Mike Riddle claims makes something impossible. Yet it happens every single time someone shuffles a deck of cards. So go ahead, impress us with how unlikely you think it is for beneficial mutations to occur. Then keep in mind the sheer number of opportunities for mutations to occur. There are about 39 trillion bacteria living on your body right now. That's more bacterial cells than you cells. Multiply that by the number of people on the planet, and other animals, and the plants, and all the marine species, and so on. My point is that there is a shit ton of genetic material out there, so much that beneficial mutations are basically inevitable.
We caught up with a molecular biologist, Douglas Axe, in Seattle.
I'm curious as to why you list him in the chemical engineering department at Caltech. I looked in the directory at Caltech. There is no one there with the last name Axe. I even tried just perusing the entire chemical engineering department because sometimes directory searches can be finicky, but alas, no Douglas Axe or anything even similar was listed. Now, Douglas Axe is currently listed as the director of the Biologic Institute. Why wouldn't you use that title? Is it because the Biologic Institute is run by the Discovery Institute and you wanted to make it look like you weren't just grabbing people who are financially invested and agreeing with you? Future Rhino cutting in here for a second, I figured out their angle when saying Douglas Axe is at Caltech. With both him and Stephen Meyer, they are not listing where they are currently employed like a normal documentary would. They are listing the institution that they got their credentials from. Because both Axe and Meyer work for the Discovery Institute, and they want their little thing to look like there's no conflict of interest. Oh, also, fun fact, in Douglas Axe's 2008 paper titled Stylus, a system for evolutionary experimentation based on a protein-proteome model with non-arbitrary functional constraints, he says the following: Human language shares several interesting properties with biology. Both use complex structures to perform complex functions, the complexity in both cases being hierarchical. High-level functions and structures being built from those on a succession of lower levels. And while they clearly operate within functional constraints, neither has the highly rigid structure of formal systems like computing languages. Rather, they are characterized by an abundance of rules, virtually none of which is absolute. Add to this the fact that both biology and language have been shaped by real populations with real complex histories, and the similarities are seen to be quite extensive. So from this we find that Douglas Axe here does not seem to agree with the rest of your video that DNA is like computer code. It's more like language. So we speak language. Who invented language? Well, it was kind of developed by real populations with real and complex histories, as pointed out by Dr. Axe here. You might say it evolved. But yeah, sure, you're getting him to talk about probability, which is something that all molecular biologists specialize in, so let's see what he has to say.
In our lab work, we've asked how rare or how common functional proteins are within the space of possibilities. Doing experiments and calculations, we found that they're exceedingly rare, like 1 in 10 to the 74th power rare.
Okay, now everybody combine 2 decks of cards, now shuffle them to be completely random, and boom! Whatever order they are in now had a chance of 1 in 10 to the 166th. Am I supposed to be impressed because the numbers are big? But I wanted one specific order. The odds of that are surely less. No, they are the same, but here's the kicker. Natural selection acts to save those that are close to the order that you want and reshuffle the rest of the cards. If it can keep the ones that are in the right position and reshuffle the rest, it won't take very long at all for the cards to be in whatever order you want them to be in. Of course, natural selection in the real world took a lot longer than that, since it had to wait for the organism to reproduce and it had to fight with DNA proofreading mechanisms, but it's the same idea.
To get a feel for those odds, imagine that somebody hid one atom somewhere within the Milky Way galaxy, and you, blindfolded by chance, are supposed to pick one atom and hope that it's the right one.
I like my card shuffling comparison better. It's easier to picture, and it's very obviously not only possible, but easy.
Those odds would be better than the odds for the protein.
Axe calculated the probability for all the chance mutations in all of the life forms on Earth for billions of years. And in all that time, he found they couldn't chance on even one new functional protein structure. Not one. 0.
I was curious which paper of his demonstrated this, so I went to the video description and found no sources. So I went to the Science Uprising website where they said there were more articles, and the only Douglas Axe reference was his book. So I clicked on the Learn More About Dr. Axe link there, and that took me to the Amazon page to buy his book. Now, in that same paper where Dr. Axe pointed out why computer code is not a perfect analogy for DNA, I did see him refer to the real evolutionary history for gene encoding paths, so this does seem to be another case of a creationist scientist publishing stuff that supports evolution when they publish in real journals. Though in this case the journal is +1, which, depending on who you ask, can be a bit iffy to say the least. Though I will point out to their credit that in this instance the academic editor left a comment on the paper where they admit that Dr. Axe's connection with the Discovery Institute could create the appearance of ideologically based research, but that they did not detect such a bias and that the results of this particular paper do not support intelligent design at all. My point here is that of the 9 papers published by Dr. Axe in real journals, not creationist rags, there was no such paper.
And keep in mind, it takes thousands of distinct proteins to build any kind of complex life, including humans.
Yep, and it's had about 4 billion years to get there. Also, just as an aside, if God wanted to set us apart from the rest of the animal kingdom, maybe he shouldn't have made us use all the same proteins as the rest of the animal kingdom? Or have a genome that is nearly identical to chimpanzees?
And many of these proteins are unique to each individual life form.
And many are not. What does that matter, aside from being a decent demonstration of divergent evolution?
So we go from improbable to basically impossible.
Nope, that is not how probability works. If the probability is non-zero, then it is possible. Even if the probability is tiny, that does not mean it won't happen. Things with amazingly tiny probabilities are commonplace in our world.
The bottom line is that the mutation selection mechanism simply lacks the creative power to generate the new information necessary to build new organisms in the history of life.
Well, that was a word salad and a half. There was a lot of loaded language in there that kind of twists things around, like he's saying something that's not technically untrue, but it ignores the bigger picture. The mutation selection mechanism would be either natural selection, sexual selection, or artificial selection. And no, the mechanisms themselves do not have creative power, not even artificial selection, as artificial selection, like the other two, is limited to selecting from existing mutations. Yes, the selection mechanism part of evolution does not generate new information. Mutations themselves are the new information, and then these various selection mechanisms determine which new information can stick around. So yeah, he's not technically wrong that the selection mechanism itself is not creative, but that has zero impact on the theory of evolution, as nobody that I am aware of is claiming that the selection mechanisms themselves are the creative forces behind evolution.
If the material processes of mutation and natural selection aren't capable of producing the biological information needed for life, then where did it come from?
Well, you did a piss-poor job of trying to show that mutations can't produce new information, and you were wrong. You then got Stephen Meyer, an intelligent design advocating philosopher, to say that the selection mechanisms don't produce new information. So, to reiterate, mutations produce new information. The selection mechanisms act on this new information. Over time, the new information keeps piling up and results in diversity.
Our uniform and repeated experience, as Darwin himself pointed out, is the basis of all scientific reasoning about the past. So when we see information in a digital form in software, or we see a paragraph in a book, and we trace that information back to its source, we always come to a mind, not a material process. That's part of what we know from our observation of the world around us.
Ooh, the teleological argument is sneaking in there. But once again, you need to nail down a definition of information. Because the molecular composition of a crystal contains information. Very complex information. But I don't see any creationists arguing for a creator because of the information contained in crystals, or rocks, or air, or anything else, really. They just focus on DNA as if that's the only thing in nature that contains information.
That information always arises from an intelligent source.
Information is way too nebulous of a term here. You need to give a specific definition of how you're using the word before a claim like that actually means anything. You are relying completely on your audience's intuitive sense of what information is in order to make your point. That's basically it for this one. They just summarize for the rest and then do their creepy little Borg chant thing. Just a little tip for you guys. If you want to convince people who don't already agree with you, then ending all of your videos with an identical bit with everyone saying the same lines like robots makes you look like a creepy cult. Maybe don't do that. And along those lines, today's comment of the day comes to us from Nathan Lang, who says, "We are the Discovery Institute. Lower your logic and surrender your science. We will add your intellectual and creative distinctiveness to our own. Your philosophies will adapt to service us. Resistance is futile." I got a kick out of that, but I really hope resistance isn't futile. That's kinda my whole shtick. Special thanks this week goes to Heiko from Germany, who was kind enough to purchase the New Strong's Expanded Exhaustive Concordance of the Bible for me off of my Amazon wishlist. So, as always, links to Patreon, PayPal, and social media and whatnot are in the description. See you next time.